All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Atheist Advocate. I am your host, Maxwell Yates, and here with me today to debate the existence of the soul is a man who had a very lengthy resume he sent me and demanded I read, although I will not do it because I do not like to stroke the ego of apologists. The ego is already big enough. Dr. Eric Hernandez, thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you. Not a doctor, but thank you. I appreciate the respect.
No, not a doctor, so you are not an expert on any of the issues we are about to speak on. That is a good note to make in advance. Not that you haven't
How about
been...
out of curiosity, how about yourself? Do you have a doctorate?
I do have a doctorate. Mine is in kicking butts and taking names when it comes to Christian apologists.
So I guess you have no expertise in these areas either. It's good.
Well, you will not have me break character this early. I shall remain strong. So I guess before we delve into the debate, maybe tell the audience a bit about yourself, your YouTube channel, what you do.
Yeah, sorry. I expected your tone to change. Usually when you get to the end of a sentence, people's tone changes. Yours just stayed the same the entire time. So I'm not sure if you're finished. Yes. So my name is Eric Hernandez. I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses putting together what we call the unapologetic evangelism conferences and doing trainings at churches, doing online discussions with gentlemen like yourself on various topics regarding God, Christianity, the soul, morality, Molinism, free will, things of that nature.
Very good. And so you often are very outspoken about the issues we'll be debating today, the existence of the soul, that kind of thing. I do recommend people go subscribe to your YouTube channel. Typically, I don't do that for theists, but the reason I would suggest people do that is because you have uploaded debates yourself that you've had with Aaron Ross, Skylar Fiction, and so you've already been destroyed on this topic by Matt Dillahunty, for example. So, the goal on you to have so little self-awareness that you would upload that. But that is one reason I would like people to go subscribe to see it.
Yeah, so, I usually don't let people get away with just making claims like that without giving me timestamps and proof. But for the sake of time, I'll let you slide on that one.
Oh, I do appreciate it. So I guess I will let you go first. I have a few arguments I would like to make that the soul doesn't and cannot exist, but out of courtesy, I will allow you to go first. So any moment you are ready, you may share your screen and I shall put it up for the viewers.
All right. Let me get this going here.
And just while we are waiting on that, to let the viewers know, subscribestar.com/TUA. You can go there to see bonus content. For example, Stelman Smith Jr., my colleague, just had Tim Stratton on to talk about many things. So you can go there and you get access to all kinds of bonus content, also other things, and a book giveaway that Stelman is doing. So just wanted to make people aware of that.
Awesome. So before, let me just go ahead and share. I think the internet connection's lagging a little bit. Am I still there?
You are still here. Your screen has not popped up on my feed, however.
Okay, so
there we are.
All right. So first thing I want to first thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I took this slide from a previous debate of mine that I did on the soul. First thing I want to mention, I suppose it's not going to be in the slides here, but let's just go and do this. So I want to give two basic points that I usually use when I give a case for the soul. And the two basic points is, the first one is that consciousness is not physical. And the second is that I am more than a brain and body. And from these two, I'm going to argue. In each, you're going to have individual arguments that I am a soul. First, it'd be helpful to start by saying two things this debate is not. And I would say, first and foremost, this debate is not on how people came to believe in the soul. That would be a genetic fallacy. Neither is it a scientific question, because science it is not something that a tool we use to study metaphysics. And there's a lot more I can say to that, but just for the sake of time and to move on, to look at the first, give some definitions. The soul I would define as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness along with all of its states and properties and animates the body. Now, the soul is the self, the conscious subject. So when I use the word I am referring to me, the self. And I would put it this way. I have a body, but I don't, quote, have a soul, but rather I am a soul. And usually with people that I like to engage with, I make a joke, but I'll still make it anyways. And it is, I do have a soul. It's a Kia Soul, and it's an orange Kia Soul that's sitting in my driveway. But purposes here, a body without a soul is a corpse. Now, the Leibniz's Law of Identity is going to be helpful to understand the arguments I'm about to lay out. And according to Leibniz's Law of Identity, we could state it this way. If two things in question are identical, say some A and B, then according to Leibniz's Law of Identity, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. Say, for example, Eric Hernandez and Kendall Hernandez, which is my wife. Kendall Hernandez's husband is the same person as Eric Hernandez. So whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other, because we're just using one, we're talking about one person, but using two different titles to refer to this person. But if in principle, Leibniz's Law of Identity also shows us that if in principle I can find something true of one thing that's not true of the other, and vice versa, then they can't be the same thing. We'll leave it at there. So regarding the first point, consciousness is not physical. I would argue that if there is no soul, then I would argue that a strict physicalist view of human beings is the best logically consistent route to take. And according to this, consciousness, and let's first define this, there are 5 states of consciousness. There are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. And now, if consciousness is reducible to something physical or identical to something physical like the brain, then we would have to say that the mind is nothing more than a reducible or identical, which in philosophy means the same thing as the brain. And if physicalism is true, then whatever is true of the mind is going to be true of the brain and vice versa. So you take a state of your mind, and whatever that brain state is, it's going to be reducible in some way to that if there is no soul and physicalism is true. But I would argue that just like the previous example I gave, if in principle I can find something true of one that's not true of the other, then they're not the same thing. And I think that is relatively easy to do. Take, for example, the conscious state of having a thought or belief. A thought or belief can be true or false, but no state of my brain is true or false. Neurons firing are not true or false. When I'm hungry, my neurons, though there's a correlation and a brain firing, my neurons aren't hungry, but I'm hungry. My brain can be in a state of weighing 3 pounds, but my thoughts don't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or taste of banana is not 7 inches long. And there's many more examples I can go through, but it follows that if all the properties of the mind are not physical, but are what we would call sui generis, new properties, and all the properties of the brain are physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it cannot be identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. One quick thing to say is that what I just talked about is a relationship of identity, but it's important to note that cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. In other words, as a substance dualist, I'm not going to deny that there are correlations, cause and effect relations, and even perhaps dependent relationships between the mind and brain, but this isn't sufficient to establish identity. I'm going to skip some of this here. Now, let's look at the second point, I am more than my brain and body. Now, going back to the law of identity, if I am nothing more than a brain and body, then I would be what philosophers would call a Mereological Aggregate, which would be a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. But there are characteristics that are true of aggregates that I'm going to argue aren't going to be true of me, which means I can't be merely reducible to a set of parts like an aggregate. Things like watches, Lego bricks, or cars are aggregates. And this would mean that their existence and identity is necessarily dependent on their properties and parts. Take a tricycle, for example. If you take one wheel off of a tricycle, it ceases to be a tricycle and a bicycle comes into existence. And that tells us that for aggregates, purely physical objects, again, their existence and identity is dependent on their parts. Now, I'm going to argue that there are things true of purely physical objects that are not true of me, and it would follow that I must be something more than a brain and body. So one is the indivisibility of personhood. And again, I'm going through these pretty fast, so we can get into that in the discussion. Premise one would be I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or I am an immaterial soul. Premise two, purely physical objects can be divided and come in percentages or degrees. Premise three, I cannot be divided or come in percentages or degrees. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. And conclusion, therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. So To understand this argument, it's important to understand the notion of degreed and non-degreed properties. So a degreed property would be something like the property of being loud or hard or soft. They can fluctuate. They can exist in percentages or degrees. It can go up or down. So something that's hard can be softer or harder. Something that's loud can be louder or softer. Now contrast that with non-degreed properties, like the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even properties, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2, because the property of being even is a non-degreed property, is an all or nothing kind of thing. With this in mind, I possess the attribute of being a person. I have personhood, and I'm going to argue that personhood is not a degreed property. Now, if there is no soul, then I would be a purely physical object, and I would be a degreed property. Imagine something like a table. It makes sense to say that there is 50% of a table or 50% of a door. But if you cut off my arms and legs, I'm not 50% of a person. I'm still 100% a full-blown person. I may lose functioning, but I don't lose personhood. Now, if you're going to say there is no soul, then you're going to have to ground being a person in something physical like the brain and body, but we know that this fluctuates and changes. Men are typically larger than women, but it wouldn't follow that because men are typically larger than women, that they somehow have more personhood or value. Put differently, having more mass and matter doesn't mean we matter more. But if there's no soul, I would argue you're going to have to ground being a person in something physical, and this fluctuates. It can come in percentages or degrees, which would make being a person a degreed property. And I think just intuitively that's absurd. Same thing if you want to just use the brain as a grounding for personhood. There are people who are born with maybe only 80% of a brain or 70% of a brain, but they're still full persons. They just don't have a full brain, and they may lose functioning, but they don't lose personhood. A second argument is identity through change. Now, again, the premise 1, I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. Atheist philosopher Jaegwon Kim, in his book Philosophy of Mind, gives an interesting argument to consider. And he basically says it's alleged that every 7 to 10 years we replace virtually every cell in our body. And he gives the argument this way. In 2011, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2011. Therefore, I am not identical nor reducible to the brain and body. In a similar fashion here, if I'm a purely physical object, I do not retain identity through change. Premise 3, I do maintain identity through change. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. The argument from free will, and this will be my last one. And again, going through this quickly so we can get more to a discussion, because that's what I'm really looking forward to. Premise 1, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. Premise 3, I do possess free will. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, I would argue if there is no soul, then you're just a purely physical brain and body. You're just a meat machine, if you will, that is going to be causally determined by external prior factors beyond your control. If there's no God, then arguably the law of causal closure would be true, which is a notion that every physical event is going to necessarily have a prior physical cause. So Aristotle used the example in saying, if I move a rock with my staff, then he says we can explain the movement of the rock by the staff. So my staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but what moved me? Now, to give a quick definition, I would argue that libertarian free will is a position that you are the source of your will or actions. You are the first mover. Nothing prior to you causes you to act or will. Now, if the non-believer wants to maintain libertarian free will, and there's reasons for that, but I'll get to that shortly, then you're going to have to be the first mover of moving the staff to move the rock. Now, you can say, okay, well, a brain firing caused my hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused a rock to move. But given the law of causal closure, that brain firing is still a physical event and would thus necessarily need a prior physical cause. At this point, I would say you'd have two options. You can say, one, another brain firing caused that brain firing to fire, but then you just have to ask the same question. Then you're going to have to keep positing brain firings, which would lead to an infinite regress, and I think that's not a valid option. Your second option is that at some point, you're going to have to stop positing brain firings and then point to something external and prior to yourself that's going to be physical, which would mean that you're not the first mover, and thus you would not have libertarian free will. Now, you might say, and I'm not sure your position on this, but if you don't if you don't hold to libertarian free will, then you're going to have to give up rational responsibility and intellectual integrity. In other words, if there is no free will, then every thought, belief, action, desire was causally determined by external factors beyond your control, which means your very decision to become an atheist is not an intellectual decision that you can take intellectual pride or integrity in, because it was something you were causally determined to do, no more than you were causally determined to have teeth or nails or the color eyes that you have. It's not something that you did or achieved, which means you did not become an atheist on the basis of a ability to freely analyze the evidence and come to your own conclusion. With respect to moral responsibility, the same would apply. And again, we can get into discussion more. But basically, if you deny free will, then you're going to have to give up those two things, that you were not free to be an atheist. You don't have moral responsibility. And why should I then believe something that you were simply determined to do and believe? And that would make this entire debate pointless. But if you do hold that you became an atheist on the basis of your intellectual integrity and free will, then it follows that a soul must exist. And if the soul exists, then the debate's settled there. And I'll go ahead and stop my part there. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. So I do very much appreciate your presentation there. Forgive me if, as I'm going through these counterpoints, if I miss something you believe to be particularly relevant. I wasn't able to get notes of everything, but if I miss something, just remind me of it if you believe it should be visited again. So you said consciousness is not physical, and I would agree. A large portion of the arguments you made would not apply to me, because I do believe in emergentism. I do believe that consciousness is something that emerges from physical things, but of course it can ultimately be explained by those physical things. We don't need to appeal to magic or superstitious beliefs or anything of the sort. You said not a scientific debate, but of course that would presuppose your position, because if we can use science to prove that everything we think is consciousness or think is a soul boils down to physical explanations, then we've won the debate. But if you're just going to presuppose, well, there must be something metaphysical that science can't touch, well, then you're simply arguing in a circle. I don't know what this note, you wrote, a body without a soul is a corpse. But of course, when people are killed or murdered, it's not somebody reaches in them and rips out their soul. No, they affect their body in some way. I would say a body without a brain, if you blow a bullet through someone's brain, is a corpse. So these are things we know, that if you affect the body, that's what kills a person. It's not some kind of mystical taking of their soul. Sensations, you said, these were talking about the law of identity. Sensations are things that we experience that, but of course, for example, people have medical disorders where they can't feel pain. So we do know that, a sensation, of course, touches nerve endings and they ultimately go into my brain. And if you affect that part of the brain, it's not as though there's an immaterial soul that can still feel pain. No, there is no experience of pain once you affect the brain. Relationship. Yes, you pointed to relationships that someone can point out correlations between certain neurons firing and sensations, or neurons firing and choices, that this doesn't prove they're identical. Again, of course, I agree they're not identical, but I do think we can prove that all the things that we attribute to the mind are caused by the brain. The aggregate point. You should know better. Matt Dillahunty, I do believe, corrected you on this when you said a human isn't, or a soul isn't kind of an aggregate of things. Well, we do know from the V.S. Ramaswamy studies, where he did these split brain studies. They cut a person's brain in half, and of course, we do know that the consciousnesses were separated. That there was two distinct people that could identify as such. The left brain, high side of the brain, could talk. The right side of the brain could not, but of course it could write, controlling the left hand. And one identified as an atheist, the other identified as a theist. One put a cigarette in its mouth, the other one took it out. These are completely different people. So I don't buy your argument that that personhood is indivisible. And this was one I was able to grab a screenshot of, and I do want to put up for a moment to address it. Well, according to your own first premise, dualism can't be true. If you're either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul, you've merely refuted your own position with your first premise there. Purely physical objects can be divided and come in percentages or degrees. Agreed. I cannot be divided, but of course the studies that I just cited would prove that idea wrong. So I shall take that down. 80% of a brain, full person. Well, we still define people as part of the human race. Of course, characteristics, like say someone is particularly caring or has an endearing quality about their personality. Well, of course, if you cut their foot off, you don't affect that part of the brain that causes those characteristics. So we still identify people. It's more of a sentimental thing. We identify people as part of the human race. But of course, I would say if personhood is all the things caused by the brain, the characteristics, how someone has tastes for particular food or preferences for certain movies. Of course, that can be divisible or partial if you take away those parts of the brain. The person, if you take away all possibility of taste, they're not the same person they were before. But we sentimentalize these things and still say, well, you're part of the human race, so we're still going to call you a full person. And then the last thing I took notes on was free will. Of course, people can go check out the debate I had with Braxton Hunter on this. I think I proved my case. I think my case wins out at the end. I destroyed Braxton on that. I do not believe that there is any such thing as libertarian free will. I do think we can demonstrate that and prove it. However, ironically, Braxton Hunter has provided me with an argument to sustain free will and explain free will on naturalism through quantum indeterminacy. Although I do think time will not be as well spent on that topic unless you particularly want to. So I would like to give you over the floor now to respond to the things I have said.
Yeah, thank you. So I didn't really hear you present a case as to why, because earlier you said that you believe that the soul not only doesn't exist, but cannot exist. I didn't hear any arguments for that. I just heard you
So I
respond
will
to my
provide
argument.
those, but I wanted to be able to, instead of shifting the focus to too many topics at a time, deal strictly with your arguments. Then after we do get through this, we will go into my arguments.
Okay, sure. So one of the first things you said was that you hold to like an emergent type position. So there's a few problems with that, but I think the first thing to note is that you would still be a dualist. So you would just at best be a property dualist, but maybe not a substance dualist. But now you have these what we would call sui generis properties that exist that you're going to have to say is going to come from, I'm assuming, a brain firing or function, or what would you say?
Sure, yes, it's a combination of neurons and chemicals and such things, started in animals, and
So are thoughts and beliefs physical?
well, thoughts and beliefs are contained in something physical, my brain. It's like the information in a hard drive, right? It's not like if I have a video of you and me and I store it on a hard drive, it's not as though you and I exist inside the hard drive. There's information in the hard drive, and the information isn't something physical. So, thoughts and beliefs aren't physical, but they're stored in the hard drive of the brain.
Okay, so they're not physical, thoughts and beliefs.
Sure.
Okay, so then you're a dualist like me. You're just not a substance dualist.
I am perfectly comfortable with the descriptor. What did you say? Property dualist.
Property dualist. Yeah. So okay. So I would say that would be inconsistent because first and foremost, I would say that at best, all you're going to be able to do is, if you're going to say it emerges, all you're going to be able to do is appeal to something like structural properties. So because I don't think consciousness it's something that's going to be popping into existence by a rearrangement of neurons. In fact, we know that it's not as if you have all these neurons and you take a few away, then all of a sudden this somehow this consciousness doesn't exist, as if it's in there. Or the emergent property, let me touch on that actually really quick first. So say you have a pile of boards, and you can say that these pile of boards, they have the property of just being a pile. You can rearrange the structure, and then you can make it into a raft, and then it has a property of being a raft. But we know that these properties emerge on the basis of their structure, but it's something that's within them from the bottom. I would say it would be metaphysically impossible, first and foremost, for something like consciousness to be stored in something physical like the brain, because I believe it was Leibniz, and Plantinga has a great article on this called Against Materialism, that if we could shrink down to the level of an atom, our brain is mostly empty space. You're not going to find thoughts in there. You're going to find neurons firing, but you're not going to find thoughts. So I don't even know what it would mean to say that if I think of a pink elephant, that thought is in a group of neurons or a group of neurons firing.
If you open up a hard drive, can you see the ones and zeros?
Well, no, but that's exactly it. The information is not identical to an image. It may create something when put in the right retrieval system. Kind of like you take a CD and you put the music on a CD. It's not identical to it, nor is the music actually in the CD itself. Right. Okay. So it's not in something physical.
Well, sure, I don't think I made the argument that consciousness is inside the brain, but just as the part of, I don't know what the technical term for it would be, but whatever the physical attributes that make up the CD can produce the music, the physical attributes of the brain and for neurons firing and chemicals produces consciousness. And I wouldn't say it simply pops into existence through evolution. It was very gradual coming into being.
So you would need something more than the CD, right? You would need something more than just information. You need some type of retrieval system, even in a computer software program.
Sure, I will be perfectly fine saying that. And I would say human beings are more complex than the most complex computer that we can create. So we can, all of those things, the retrieval system, the information storage, that can all be in there.
Sure. So here's my question then. What is it that's conscious? So if my brain is producing consciousness, what is it that is conscious?
What is it that is conscious?
So when I get hungry, are my neurons hungry?
Well, no, of course, but we do know you can kill certain places in the brain to kill the feelings of hunger.
Yeah, but that's not what I asked.
No, but it's relevant to your point, because I think you're trying to trap me on this, saying that there's some kind of identical relationship between a sensation like hunger and certain neurons firing, and I'm not saying that there's an identical relationship between them. But of course, the neurons firing directly cause the sensation of hunger.
Well, so maybe you missed the question I asked. What is hungry?
What is hungry?
Right. So you have for example, in other words, you're saying that these neurons cause this mental state, right?
Yes.
So I can say in some sense, so Eric is a man, my father is a man, but I'm not identical to my father. We can say in some sense my father had a hand in causing my existence. So the cause is something different than what's going on.
Yeah,
so I'm different than my
similar stuff.
Sure, that's fine. But then you're going to have to say that consciousness is composed of some similar stuff to something physical. But I think the law of identity, as I showed in the beginning, would dispute that. But so if my neurons are causing consciousness, where is that? So if this part of my brain is firing to cause a thought, and if this isn't my thought that's firing, where is my thought and what is it that's thinking if not those neurons firing? In other words, if you're going to reject identity, which is fine, then what is it that's thinking?
It's the brain.
The brain as a whole?
Well, it produces experiences that
who experiences?
Well, you can call that the collection of atoms and chemicals and neurons firing that make you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, that's what experiences it. I don't experience anything that your brain does because I'm not a collection of the same stuff.
Could you describe to me what a belief is in purely physical terms?
Well, so let me go back to your previous question about hunger. You said, what is hunger? And I think this will be relevant.
What is hungry? What is it that possesses that hunger?
Well, so through the process of biological evolution, we hold it on to certain things. So, for example, creatures who did not feel hungry just starved to death and died off. And so we are creatures that have evolved certain neurons in our brains to recognize when there is not enough food to keep us alive. And so those neurons fire in such a way that I have an experience that tells me, hey, you need to put something inside your stomach so that you don't die. But it's all the neurons. And the reason I say that is because I might not be able to say what a belief is. And this is what apologists love to do. They say, well, you can't say what the belief is or what exactly the self is. Therefore, I can just impose my God into it, which is a very important subject, by the way, because, of course, depending on what culture you grow up in, you might believe in reincarnation or that Buddha gave you the soul or that Yahweh gave you the soul.
Usually when you don't have a good answer, you start going to different topics, and I can see that happening. But note, I never said that you can't tell me what a belief is, therefore there's a soul. I just asked you what a belief was in terms of purely physical, given purely physical terminology. The fact that you can't name it isn't me saying you can't do it. That's just you perhaps implicitly conceding that you can't, but that's fine.
Well, I'm happy.
Let me say,
unlike apologists, when I don't have an answer to a question, I'm comfortable saying I don't know. I know a lot of people not comfortable admitting such things.
Yeah, yeah, I like your mug, by the way.
Yes, I got this from that scammer, Cameron Batuzzi.
um, So yeah, I'm perfectly fine with admitting when I don't know too. One last thing I'll say about emergentism, because that's just one of the first things you mentioned, is that you're also going to lead into what's called epiphenomenalism, I would argue, where these conscious, well, let me ask it this way. Do you think that your mental states cause anything?
That my mental states cause anything. Could you give me an example of what you're talking about? Because I want to be very careful about that terminology.
Yeah, if I have a mental state of hunger,
okay,
I can say that that has some type of influence, or I don't know if you'd want to say even causal influence, to cause me to go get something to eat.
Sure, but of course you can't say, well, if so, I'm going to get something to eat. What's the explanation? When you go back one step and you say, well, it's the mental state. But of course you can't stop there. You have to go back. Well, what's the cause of that? Go one step back. It's the brain that's the neurons that caused the mental state.
That's fine. Well, that's fine. Yeah, no, it was just a simple question. So then you do think that these mental states can cause things to happen?
They can lie in the chain of causes, but the ultimate cause going back and far enough is going to be something physical.
Well, let me ask it differently, because I think you're trying to answer something that I'm not asking, because you're trying to maybe assume what you think I'm trying to ask. Is the mental state, even if it's not the first cause, is it an intermediate cause in this causal chain of events?
Sure.
Okay, well then you can't have that if you're going to go with emergentism, because epiphenomenalism is going to argue, and this position, which is why people that there are people who reject your position because of epiphenomenalism. Fire causes smoke, but it's not the smoke that causes the fire; it's the fire that causes the smoke. So your brain causes these mental states, but these mental states don't in turn cause anything to the brain. So you have these mental states just kind of floating there that are really just superfluous, just giving you these experiences, and whatever it is you even mean by you, we haven't even gotten to that yet, which you still haven't even told me what it is that possesses consciousness. So your brain's doing something that is making something have these experiences. What that is, we haven't gotten there yet. But if you're going to appeal to something like emergentism, you're going to have to deal with epiphenomenalism, where these mental states aren't going to cause anything. It's going just, it's being caused. It doesn't turn around and cause something else.
So I'm partially confused. So first, I do believe I answered it. It's whatever contains this. Is this bag of neurons, this bag of chemicals, this physical stuff that composes me? Okay, so that's the first thing. But I'm not sure what it is you're saying about in a mental state, because I don't believe that there's a mental state just floating out there that turns around and causes something else, right? It's the brain neurons. The neurons firing are the ultimate cause of me getting something to eat. And the way it does it is through the medium of a mental experience that is an unpleasant one of hunger. I don't like to starve.
Right, but that mental state of hunger doesn't cause anything. And when I say float, I don't mean like floating out there. I mean it's superfluous. It doesn't do anything. It's not causing anything. It's just there. For the sake of time, you said saying that science can answer the question is circular. No, it's not. You're saying and that I would be presupposing. No, because the same would apply to you if you're going to say that if science can use it, because you'll be supposing it's something physical. But the reason I say science can't answer the question, because even Michael Roos would say that there are some things, there are certain questions science can answer. So it's no surprise that it's not going to give us certain answers if it can't even ask the question. This is philosopher of science Michael Roos. But if the soul exists, by definition, is going to be something non-physical. In science, while it is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, if the soul exists, it's something not physical. So you can't use science, a tool like science that can study only the physical, to try and investigate the soul. It would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It's simply the wrong tool for the assessment. It's a category fallacy. So, well, I'll leave that there. You said it's not.
I would like to push back. I know you're right.
Sure.
You're correct about the time. I would like to push back a bit, because I do think some apologists are trying to use science to pinpoint the soul. If you look at some of the apologists like Gary Habermas, who will point to medical documentation of NDEs, near-death experiences, where people supposedly saw something that, while they were brain dead. He's appealing to science to try to show that there is.
Yeah.
And I believe
so. So this would be analogous to something like the Kalam, and even Dr. Craig, who uses a Kalam, is going to say something like, "Is science? What science can do is it can back up premises within an argument, but it's a philosophical argument, and the science can back up the premises within the argument itself. So it's not as if like a direct, here's something, therefore so. It's here's something that has some type of empirical basis that would lend credibility to the fact that if a soul exists, we would expect these kind of things to happen. So it's not a, quote, direct scientific argument, much like the Kalam is still a philosophical argument, but science is used to back up one of the premises within the argument itself. But it's still a philosophical argument. In fact, as Dr. J.P. Moreland would say, that when you look at the major views on the mind-body problem, these are going to be what are called empirically equivalent theories. In other words, there's no piece of data that you or I are going to disagree with scientifically. We're going to agree on all the scientific data, but our conclusions are going to be different based on the philosophical, metaphysical implications or assumptions we have when we interpret that data itself.
So, word salad to relieve yourself of the ability to explain it scientifically. I see. Next.
Do you
point,
actually
please.
have do you have an actual rebuttal aside from just saying it's word salad?
Well, I think the comparison to the Kalam is not a good one, because I do think if we have science to actually be able to investigate whether or not a person quote unquote saw something when they were brain dead, right? That's much more direct access than philosophizing about the beginning of the universe.
Say that again. You said, what did you say about science and near-death experiences?
We have direct access to a person who's claiming to see something that we can know that there's no way they could have known physically. So I just think that's a much more obviously direct form of investigation than just hypothesizing about where the universe came from.
Direct access. I think I get what you're saying. I'm just not sure if you're wording it correctly. But given that you brought up access, so one way I would even show that consciousness is something that is not in the brain is that if it were, I'd be able to open up my brain and see my thoughts, not just neurons.
I just need it produced by the brain.
Okay, so where is it?
See, you're asking a where question about something that I'm agreeing on the surface isn't something physical that you can touch. And so if it's not like the ones and the zeros aren't something physical you can touch, I don't need to say that in the CD. I just need to say the information is in the CD. So I'd say the information, the stuff that gives rise to whatever experiences consciousness.
Okay.
That's in the brain, but it's not as though consciousness is some Platonic form that we can stuff inside of a brain.
But it's something not physical, like you said, right?
Yes, but I want to be careful about my terms here. When I say non-physical, I mean just as non-physical as information, ones and zeros, things like that. I'm not hypothesizing about an angelic realm, which there's no evidence for.
Yeah, no, that's great. And information comes from minds.
Real quick, I just want to say something, because I think you said something about, digging through and getting to the bottom of something and not seeing consciousness there. Well, of course, you talk to panpsychists, which I am not, but of course, panpsychists do believe that consciousness is at the fundamental reality, is at the in every atom. So even if I were to grant some of these premises, you still have to contend with that. We don't conclude Christianity.
Well, I haven't.
Fallacy.
I haven't argued Christianity. I haven't brought that up in this argument. I'd be happy to if you wanted to. But even on panpsychism, there's still a type of substance dualism, which you are not. So if you want to build a panpsychism, that's fine. But now you're going to have to give up your position, and then you'll be more on my side.
Yes, I'm clear. I'm not a panpsychist. My only contention there was you simply dismissed the idea of actually finding consciousness at the most fundamental layer of reality. But of course, there are people who do make the case for that.
Sure. So I have not dismissed the idea that consciousness is fundamental to reality. In fact, as a Christian, I would say yes, it is. And his name, we call him God. I just don't think it's infused in all matter, both living and non-living, which is what a panpsychist would hold to. So a panpsychist is, I think, the best shot you have if there's no God. But I think it's going to be very ad hoc. That's not going to have any credibility. And I say ad hoc because the only reason someone is going to appeal to panpsychism is to avoid God.
Yeah, no more ad hoc than God, I would say. I mean,
I'm sure you would say that.
That's why I don't hold to it. But of course, I think it's at least simpler just to say, hey, all the physical stuff we see, there's consciousness at it, not some kind of fundamental consciousness that, of course, drowned people by the billions at the flood for his own reasons, cruel, of
Sure.
course.
Yeah, right. And again, so I want you to also note something is it's when, if you feel like you're getting into a corner, you're going to like try and take a jab like that and bring up a red herring topic, which we could talk about another time. But going back to the consciousness aspect, I don't think God's that hog, because there's plenty of other arguments aside from consciousness, and there's a great argument from consciousness. Moreland gives an illustration of like a rabbit and a magician, and saying, you don't get something from nothing, and it's going to have to be there from the beginning. And in order to explain these, quote, smaller minds, we're going to come back. You can even point to the argument from contingency with regards to consciousness, and saying that there was consciousness from the beginning that gave rise to other consciousness, namely us. And I would say that would be God. And that's not ad hoc. That is showing that you're not getting something from nothing.
Sure. So last point I want to make on this, and then I'll let you have the final say on it before because within the time we have, I would like to move to my arguments. But the last thing I'll say on this is, I think at the end of the day, I'll admit there's some questions I can't answer, but I do think it boils down to a composition and division fallacy. No one brick is a wall, but of course you build enough, a wall emerges. No one, say, molecule possesses the quality of wetness or the thing, but you put enough together and you get H2O, you get water, then you have emerging properties such like that. So I do think just saying something like, well, consciousness isn't stored in atoms or something, it's just a composition division fallacy. Whatever collection of stuff we are produces these sensations, and of course we can correlate all of this to the brain. And I know you apologists don't like it, and they call it a red herring when someone brings up something like Noah's flood or things like these. The reason I think it's relevant, and I think atheists do this, is because sometimes when we get into these very technical philosophical discussions, the Christian can present their case as though it's reasonable. Oh, it's based on this evidence, or it's based on this philosophizing, and it's really to just distract from the clear absurdity if someone just picks up the Bible and reads it for themselves.
Okay. So back to the consciousness thing. There's so much to touch on, but another thing you mentioned, just for the sake of time to move on. You said it's not as if when someone dies, it's not as if you like go in and like take the soul or rip the soul out. Well, right. It's like I don't go to a Wi-Fi router and rip out the Wi-Fi. Instead, I damage the connection that the Wi-Fi needs, or my computer needs to connect to the Wi-Fi. So I'm not ripping out the Wi-Fi. I'm just ripping or messing with the instrument. Same thing with the soul and body. And then you said that you talked about split brain. They don't cut the brain in half. It's technically cutting the corpus callosum. And there's a lot that can be said here, but one thing to note is that this phenomena only happens while these experiments are taking place. These people live mostly normal lives, and it's only under certain conditions that we have these interesting phenomena. Nevertheless, as we would both agree, if I understand correctly, we would hold that consciousness is not physical, and then I would argue that you're going to need something that's going to ground that consciousness, and it can't be in something physical like the brain or anything like that. And if you say what produces it, you're still a dualist, just not a substance dualist. You said I committed the fallacy of composition, and I can say, well, no, I think you're fully committing the fallacy of division. It's like saying if I take a red brick, one red brick is red and a whole house made of red bricks, well, it's still going to be red. No combination or structure of red bricks is going to give you the color blue. So there are some things that we can say that if at the base it has its property, it's going to maintain that property. You mentioned water having an emergent property. Well, first and foremost, I would say it's still a physical thing. And then I would even go as far as to say there's some type of a substantial change going on. Nevertheless, when you look at structural properties, we know that there's no structure of the brain that's going to give you consciousness. I don't, unless you can explain that to me. Otherwise, you're just taking that on blind faith. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But I'd have to say you're going to have more faith than I do. And my position going to be very ad hoc.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think I've heard it from many of my Christian friends who have said, well, even if I can't answer every question, I still can have enough confidence in what I have evidence for. Well, I would simply say I might not be able to answer every question about the soul and consciousness and how it works. But when we have the mountains upon mountains of scientific evidence that comes up showing, brain damage causes memory loss, what we constitute pieces of a person. We know that memories...
and therefore what? So let's touch on that because we're jumping around a little bit. Let's see if we can just kind of get on one thing. So brain damage causes memory loss. Therefore,
memories are clearly stored in the brain.
Well, so here's what's confusing though. Is earlier you said your thoughts, your beliefs, these mental states are not in the brain. Then now you're saying they are in the brain.
I'm saying the
You're
information
out of both sides of the mouth here.
The information that we experience as now, the experience, you're right, is not what's stored in the brain. But the information that gives rise to the experience is what's stored in the brain. So I'll separate those two things.
Okay, so the information is stored in the brain. What would that look like? Because again, so right. So let me try this again because I still want to get clear on what it is you're saying because, like I said, it sounds like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You mess with the brain like Alzheimer's. You can
talking out of one side like this. That would be silly.
You mess with your brain, you can mess with my memory. Therefore.
Well, okay, that's a good point because you're saying
I just had a question. That's not even a point, but okay.
But if I can be so presumptuous, I think I can recognize the point that the question is leading to, which is some form of correlation doesn't equal causation. Would that be fair?
Oh, that's a good point you made there. Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Yes, but of course, what I do is I look at it and I say, okay, you damage the brain, you can get rid of memories. So it clearly seems that memories aren't something that is stored by an immaterial soul, which would, of course, keep the memories if you damage the brain.
How's that?
How is what? Memories being stored by the soul?
You said clearly it shows that the memories aren't in the soul. How do you gather that?
Well, because you want to posit some extra substance that shouldn't be affected by brain damage.
Why wouldn't it be? So when I damage my router, it messes with the Wi-Fi and the connection.
Do you believe in heaven and an afterlife?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you pluck the soul out of the body and take it to heaven, does it have all the same memories?
Yeah.
Right. So
it in fact is the router, if you will, the router has been fixed or freed of damage.
Oh, well, see, now you're adding something, and you can get into the creation of the second body, but of course I'm talking strictly about the soul without the body.
So Moreland gives this illustration. He says, suppose I'm trapped in a car, they welded the door shut. It would follow that as long as I'm in this car, my ability to move around town is going to be dependent on the proper function of the car. So if as long as the car can move, I can move while I'm in the car. And let's say my car steering wheel is broken where I can only move left. Well, it'd follow I can move left. But once I'm able to get out of the car, I can move wherever I want. But that doesn't show that I am a car just because I'm confined to the damages of the car.
So that would be a fair point if, and only if, we were somehow able to access the soul of, say, a person who has Alzheimer's and access the soul and prove that they actually know all of the things that they can't manifest. But for all we know, they actually don't know the things that they have apparently forgotten.
Well, I never said they did. And it's interesting. You said that would only be true if we can access. No, it wouldn't only be true if we can access. That's more of an epistemic position. We would know it would be true if we can access that, but it wouldn't only be true if we could access that. Even if we can access that, it could still be true.
I said it would be a good point if. So I'm acknowledging that it's an epistemic idea there, but I would say precisely because we can't have that epistemic so it's an irrelevant point. It's purely
So you keep mentioning this a few times about the soul being ad hoc, but then we go to the three arguments I use to show that I am more than a brain and body: indivisibility to personhood, identity through change, and free will. Which one of those do you want to talk about first?
Identity change. Well,
identity through change.
I would say free will has been done to death. I would say it does seem. What was the first one you mentioned? The divisibility of thought. I think the VSR,
indivisibility of person.
I'll take an actual expert who's published the scientific findings in the spirit-based brain things over the word of someone who has, by his own admission, is not a doctor. I don't think that the two brains, one was saying I'm an atheist, one was saying no, I'm a theist, and then after they're outside of the confines of the study, they go home and say, "Oh, we sure fooled them, didn't we?" Of course, that would be silly.
And what would that prove?
That consciousness is divisible. You said it's not divisible. But it
Okay,
is.
right. So personhood, not I didn't say consciousness wasn't divisible. I said personhood, but even then I wouldn't say that's dividing consciousness. What that's doing is and let me simplify this. So suppose one hemisphere of my brain has all my doubts, and the other hemisphere of my brain has my answers to my doubts. So suppose while they're working together, I no longer have these doubts because I have the answers. But suppose you cut the corpus callosum and you isolate my ability to access only one part of my brain, which has the doubts. And then if you isolate that, then sure, I might be an atheist because I don't have the answers. But then once you go to the other hemisphere, now I have the answers. So there's various ways of explaining this, and we can, and it is indeed an interesting phenomenon. Nevertheless, it doesn't show that there is no soul, nor that consciousness is contained or stored in the brain, or nor that consciousness is anything physical. I'm not saying you're saying that, but those would be the points and conclusions you want to draw in order to make a case against mine. And even if I grant some of the things you're saying, none of that would, in any sense, affect the arguments that I've made. So I'm curious as to what point you think you're making with that.
I mean, I actually agreed with most of the conclusions you drew there. You said it doesn't prove that there's not a soul, or it doesn't prove whatever. It does specifically prove wrong the very specific point that it is not divisible.
I see. So I think you're confused about what. So being a person is what I'm saying is not divisible. So if you so if I chop off your arms, are you still 100% a person?
See, the problem is I don't know if that question is possible to answer, because we're going to have to define what do we mean by person. Like, if you're presupposing person is immaterial, then perhaps I couldn't say that. If we mean by person, we just mean a sentimental statement of you are a member of the human race, and so we treat you as such. Maybe we wouldn't say we treat someone differently by the person, but I would say, strictly speaking, if person means the physical thing that I am, then yes, I do become less of a person. I become less of the physical stuff that makes me me. If you chop off my hands.
Okay, so even in my argument, I said this. So, are you misogynistic? Do you think men are more persons and more valuable than women because they typically have more mass and matter than them?
No, I'm not a patriarchal Christian.
That's not what I asked. But you did say that being a person would be in some sense grounded in the physical mass and matter that make us up. So someone with more mass and matter would have more personhood and more value. So you would have to concede, whether you've thought about it or not is irrelevant. Based on what you said, you're going to have to bite the bullet and concede that men are...
I said, if that's what we mean by person. But of course, I would probably agree with you that we mean multiple things, because I would say we also mean a member of this race and this community.
Well, so that's part of the argument, and I'm glad you brought that up, is that what grounds personhood? If there's no soul, let's say there's no soul, what makes me a person?
It depends if you just want to be purely descriptive, or if you want to sentimentalize how we ought to treat people in society. Well, it matters. I mean, if you say a person should be, let's say, presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? In that context, we might say, well, any person, regardless of how many hands they have, if we want to live in a society where we all get along and aren't warring, we should come up with some rules. Like, if you're a member of this human race, you'll be presumed innocent until proven guilty.
I'd like an answer there, because you're kind of going on a tangent there. What does it mean to be a person? What makes me a person? So if let's start simply. If I cut my nails, am I still a person?
Yes.
Okay, so then having nails isn't necessary for being a person. If I chop off my arm, am I still a person?
No. Yes. Sorry.
Okay, so then having an arm isn't necessary to be a person. So you see where I'm going here. How much can I take away and still be?
If you compose every single physical characteristic of a dog, you walk on all fours, you have that body type, you bark, you have canine teeth, you have fur, are you a person?
If I have all the characteristics of a dog?
Yeah.
If I have all the characteristics of a dog, how could I... And what do you mean by characteristics? Because it sounds like you're kind of asking a tautologous question.
I mean, instead of hands and feet, you have paws. And then just do that with everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a person. If I have dog features, then no, I wouldn't say I'm a person. I would say, in fact, that I
don't know exactly where to draw the line.
And I'm asking, just give me a ballpark. Just give me a ballpark. I mean, do you think a dog is a person?
No.
Okay, so we made some progress, and that's what I'm saying. I'm admittedly pressing you to where is personhood grounded if there's no, if we're just physical, what is personhood? What can we point to and say this is what makes a person a person?
Well, okay, so on one hand, you can ground it, and I think in a very literal scientific sense, in just, for example, how we differentiate species. We're clearly a human species. That is the point our evolution has reached. Now, of course, there are also societal factors that contribute to this. Again, like how we get along, how we define a person. If you're a member of the human race, if we treat you with certain values and rights, so to speak, then that's going to bring in a whole new thing of
yeah, you're still not answering the question. So let's move on. Identity through change. Am I the same person from one moment to the next? What would you say?
You're the same bag of tissue.
It's not what I asked.
Well, okay, so what do you mean by person? Because if we're talking about the purely physical stuff, then of course, right now you're the same physical stuff that you were just a minute ago. Now, I realize where this gets complicated and difficult for the naturalist to deal with is when, I think you brought it up earlier, that there have been studies that show, I think it's either 7 or 15 years.
While you're talking, I'm going to turn my camera off for a second, but I can still hear you. Yeah, but I can still hear you. I'll be right. Go ahead.
No worries. This is all people want to see anyway. So, I've lost my train of thought. Right, okay, so strictly speaking, yes, from 1 minute to the next minute, I'm the same bag of chemicals that produce the first-person experience that I have. Now, if you get into the scientific studies, I do admit it gets a little more technically difficult because you're talking about all of the physical stuff has changed. Let's take the generous estimate of 15 years, or I could even go with, if you want to use 7 years, that's a number that's been shown in some of the studies. Regardless, and this is why I was careful earlier to talk about, for example, information being stored in a hard drive or memory stored in a hippocampus. So yes, even though the physical stuff clearly changes fully, the information does clearly seem to transfer. I do have memories from more than 7 or 15 years. Clearly, that information is transferred from one system to the next system as the change.
Don't tell anybody, but I had to go to the bathroom. But that doesn't answer my question. So here's what I'm getting at here. The brain and body that you have now, did it exist in 2011?
Brain and body I have not did exist in 2011. Hold on, I'm trying. Well, again, it depends on which study you're going. If you're going with the 7-year study, then sure, no.
Okay, are you the same person?
The same information that relates to the personal experience, that whatever I would call the private access that I have, seems to be here. But I would say in a very literal sense, in a very physical sense, no. Of course
Why
not.
would it be private access, though? Because that would be a point I would make. If your mental states are only accessible through introspective awareness, not through third-party access. So, for example, you can look at me, and anybody else can that has the right tools can look at what color my hair is, or the structure of my brain, but they can't look at my thoughts because, like you said, it's a private, accessible thing. I would say because yes, it's stored in the soul, not in the brain. But I don't want to go back to rehash that argument. So the information you said it's no, it's not the same body. So are you grounding this identity of whatever you are? Is it in your mental states, or is it in something physical? What is it that assuming that you do think you're the same person? I'm not sure if you've answered that or not. Are you the same person?
In some senses, no. In some senses, yes.
So if you commit a crime 10 years ago and they just now find the evidence 10 years later, can they arrest you? And whoever they're arresting, are they arresting the person that committed the crime, or are they arresting somebody else that just looks like you?
It's funny. That would be a question of law, and ought we? You can get into a discussion about morality and how we should conduct a society and the rest of it. I wouldn't say that's particularly relevant to the question, because let's just say.
Well, then I don't think you understood the question. Then let me try to rephrase it. Whoever they're arresting, all I'm asking, I'm not even asking if they should or shouldn't. I'm asking, are they arresting the same person that committed the crime 10 years ago? Yes or no?
In a very literal scientific sense, no. But of course, but if you get into the information, again, the information that produces the private access that I have private access to, which I will answer that question. You could say yes in a weird way, but of course, it's funny you bring that up. Suppose someone I committed a crime 10 years ago, and I was caught 10 years ago and put in jail, and they've deemed me now rehabilitated for all intents and purposes, the type of person who can be in society, whereas 10 years ago, they deemed me I was not a person who could be in society. So by those standards, even those standards, I would be a different person. On the one hand, I'm a person who should be behind bars. 10 years later, I'm a person who is safe in society.
So then whoever committed the crime ceased to exist? That person ceased to exist? And now it's just someone that looked like him?
The physical chemicals and neurons that made up that person cease to exist. But of course, the private access of the experiences continues.
And what is it that grounds that continuation?
Grounds the continuation? I mean, I would say fundamentally the information that's been transferred.
So it's information. Can there be multiple yous?
Not simultaneously.
Why not, if it's the same information?
Oh, pardon me. Let me correct myself because I contradicted myself. Yes, there can be multiple me's, as the V.S. Ramachandran studies show. There can be at least two if you split my brain in half.
But they wouldn't be multiple yous because they don't share the same information. That was part of your argument, was that they have different information, hence they have come to different conclusions. So no, you couldn't say that they're both you, according to your own standard.
Oh, sure. I would say yes if you're talking about strictly the same pieces. If you have 5 pieces of information, they can't simultaneously be one person and another. Sure. But of course, that's just not the way biology works.
But you're the one that reduces information. If I can take the same information and put it in other bodies, it would have to be another you. But if you like, we can move on. Let's. I know you said free will has been, I forgot what the word you used, but did you really come to be an atheist?
Oh, pardon me. Let me just. Well, okay. This bag of chemicals changes over 10 years, right? The information, like the memories, transfers, and the information is what gives rise to personal experience. So that private access of experience can stay even through the change of chemicals because the information transfers. I hope that answers the point. Did I freely choose to be an atheist? Here again, if pressed into a corner, I can always appeal to Braxton Hunter's argument from quantum indeterminacy to show I do. But here's the thing: I don't even think you need that. I mean, I can admit I'm fully determined all the way down, but so is a calculator, right? And yet it comes to the right answers. So I don't think this idea that just because I was determined to come to a certain conclusion doesn't invalidate the conclusion.
So a few things here. One is, I'm not saying you cannot have beliefs that correspond with reality. I'm saying you wouldn't be rational in holding to those beliefs if they were purely determined. So let me put it this way. Here's a thought experiment I did with Aaron Raw. I'd like to know your thoughts. Suppose I told you, look, there's John Smith over there. Unbeknownst to him, I put something in his coffee that when he took a sip, these micro machines went into his brain, and now I have control of whatever he thinks and believes, and I'm making him think and believe he's in the Matrix, whatever the case is. Would you? And let's say we're making him believe things like 2 + 2 = the square root of -3, and he believes it's true. Is he rational in believing that, if I'm the one controlling all of his thoughts and beliefs and behaviors?
Nope.
Okay. So why would you be rational if everything you do, think, and believe is caused or determined by external factors beyond your control?
See, this is the sleight of hand. I see. You start with a person.
My hands are right here.
You started off with a person who's deliberately causing certain beliefs, and then somehow substitute that for the laws of nature, which of course are incorrect because truth is beneficial for survival. Rationality is a process of nature.
Well, let's table that for a second. Yeah, so you're saying I started with the person, and then now I'm talking about nature, right? It's even worse on your position because there's not even a mind behind it. So it's even worse than the previous position. So if you thought the previous position was irrational, then you must really think your position has to be irrational.
Well, two things. Number one, the person can have ill-gotten motives for causing the second person to believe whatever they have. is blind, right? So whatever works for survival, which of course is going to be having true beliefs, is going to be what works and what triumphs.
Well,
We don't want nature be somehow being deceitful and trying to lead us to false beliefs.
sure. Well, then I'd have to go into Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, which would be a whole nother discussion. But let's go back for a second. I'm sorry.
He fails tremendously, but continue.
Okay, sure. So you said a calculator is determined, right? So is a magic 8. So is a magic 8 ball. What's the difference?
A magic 8 ball, it operates purely on chance. You could take a magic 8 ball. Suppose that the thing inside it that gives you different thing is just a bunch of different numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say 1 through 8 or whatever, and you say, what does 2 plus 2 equal? And you shake it. You might get all kinds of answers. Calculators don't work like that. You ask it, you type it, 1 is 2 plus 2 equal, you're always going to get 4.
How do you know the calculator is correct?
How do I know the calculator is correct? Because I can compare it with all our mathematicians, what we know. I can compare it with putting 2 apples here and 2 apples here and comparing them.
Yeah, so what you're doing is basically saying you believe the calculator because you were determined to believe that the calculator was true. And then you can test this by pointing to something else which you were equally determined to do and believe, and you're back to the same problem. You're basically saying I can believe what my brain tells me because my brain tells me I can believe it. Now that is circular reasoning, and you're stuck in what Plantinga calls a dialectical a loop, a vicious circle.
How about we get to the real problem?
That is a real problem.
Okay, so
if that's your way of dodging, that's fine.
Sure. Because I find it comical when apologists do this. Tim Stratton does the same thing. I think Black Hunter did the same thing with me, where he starts off with an analogy. Okay, here I am as a person determining the third person certain things, right? And then they substitute that for the laws of nature, determining you to believe substantive things. Well, here's a question. What is more analogous than the laws of nature? Anyone? How about God, a conscious person, determining you what to believe and creating the world where you become a Christian and I become an atheist? Therefore, neither of us had any say in the matter.
Yeah, so two things. And first of all, what you said wasn't an objection. All you're doing is complaining the way I presented my argument. Complaints aren't objections. So you can complain that you don't like the way I presented it or what illustration I use, but that doesn't do anything to rebut my argument.
One thing, if the analogy works one way, it works the other way.
Say again? You're right. So that's my next point. So the second thing I'd say is that, so I'm not a Calvinist. So I don't believe that God's called to determine these things in my thoughts and beliefs. So that wouldn't apply to me. But if you're going to say that, oh, it works both ways, and you're just saying, well, I know you are, but what am I? Which means you're implicitly conceding that it is a problem for your position. But if I'm not a Calvinist and it doesn't apply to my position, so now you're the only one with the problem.
I can apply to quantum indeterminacy.
Yeah, no, that won't work either, because at best that would just give us perhaps epistemic room to think there's a possibility. That doesn't mean ontologically speaking, it's actually that there's actually some type of free will. If you're not the first mover, which you can't be if causal closure is true, then it doesn't matter what you appeal to. You're not going to be the first cause. You're just going to be spontaneous. But I would say there's still some type of causal mechanisms behind that, even if we can identify them. So I think that's a bait and switch myself.
Are you a Molinist?
I am.
Oh, I love this because I think this is even worse than the Calvinists. So, did you choose to become a Christian?
Yes.
Okay. Did God create you and put you in the circumstance where he knew that's what you would choose?
Yes. Where I would choose freely, yes. He put me in a situation in which he knew that I would freely make this decision.
Call it free, but here's the point. He was the one who decided to put you in the situation and not a different situation where you would freely make another choice. So how is your choice not meaningless, even if you use the word free?
Well, I don't know what you mean by meaningless, but if I'm the first...
born.
Say again?
It was determined before you were even born.
Well, it depends what you mean by determined. If you mean causally determined, I would say no, because if I'm the first mover, then that's not determinism. God knowing what I would do doesn't determine my actions. In fact, he knows what I would do because that's in fact what I will do. So it's you've got the cart before the horse there. And
backwards causation?
No, not backwards causation. It's that God, being omniscient, would have foreknowledge of what I would do in a given circumstance. When I proposed to my wife, I set up the entire date. I bought the dress she would wear, the shoes she would wear, the jewelry she would wear, and I set it all up and had my soon-to-be mother-in-law lay this out for her on her bed. So when she got home from work, she saw the note, and everything was set up, and I knew how she would respond. Just that wasn't a backward causation, knowing that if I did X, Y, and Z, she would say yes. I also knew what it would have taken for her to say no. I could have been rude to her. We were on it was like a 2-hour dinner cruise where they just like take you around the bay and they feed you dinner on a boat. I could have pushed her on the boat and then laughed at her and say, oh, by the way, will you marry me? She would have said no. But that's not backward causation. My knowledge of what she would do in a given situation doesn't cause these things to happen, even if I know the circumstances that would lead to a certain a response from her. So no, that's in no way determinism.
I do have a rebuttal to this, although I'm skeptical to get into it because I wouldn't want it to be misinterpreted as me speaking ill of someone else's wife. So, not that I mean it like that. I mean, maybe because I don't want to
find out where you live.
I want to be careful with my words here. You said you knew that when she got home and saw the dress in the note, how she would respond.
And then when I dropped on one knee, yes. And then when I dropped on one knee, and yes.
God forbid, and I'm not wishing this on anybody, is why I'm skeptical of saying it, because words have power and whatnot. God forbid something on God forbid on her way home, somebody kidnapped her and took her to Paris.
Right.
And kept her there for the rest of her life. Now what things you knew would happen don't happen. The point is, now there would be a difference. There would be more of a deterministic. If you could say how determined even monkey the laws to determine her route to get home, that's of course what God does. So
it seems you're maybe not fully grasping Molinism, what Molinism entails. The moment you start changing things, it's no longer the same situation. First of all, even if hypothetically speaking, in the scenario she were, I'm sorry.
That's the point. God set up the circumstances.
So let me finish my thought here. Me knowing how she would have responded had things played out the way they did, in no way has anything to do with what would have happened had a different set of circumstances turned out. So I'm saying if A happens, B is going to happen, and you say, yeah, but what if X would have happened instead of A? Well, that doesn't negate the counterfactual that if A, then B. So that's completely irrelevant. I don't know why you thought that would be a good point to bring up. All that shows is that I don't have exhaustive knowledge. But if God is omniscient and has exhaustive knowledge of any and every possible counterfactual scenario that we can be put in, and if we're still the first movers, then libertarian free will exists and there's no causal determination.
I see your point there. I think it's a fair point to end on. I just personally, to me, it's a difference because what you just brought up, I think, is of course, there are counterfactual situations in which people would freely choose different things. My point is that God determined from the beginning what all of the situations would be and who would be in any given one of those situations. So to me, it just...
And I determined what situation my wife would be in when I proposed to her, where she would stand, the song that the DJ would play when I got on the boat.
Not the same way God did. Come on.
I didn't say it was. No, but you're missing the point. So I had a handle and control over the situation. For the most part, God has a bigger type of control of the situation. All you're saying is I don't have as much control as God does. Sure, I never said I did, but if you're again the first mover, and if you're doing something freely, then God knowing what it would take doesn't in any way cause me to do something. If you were to offer me a $50 steak or a Mexican pizza from Taco Bell, which pray they don't get rid of, I'm going to take the Taco Bell every time. I'm not going to go for the steak. But your knowledge of that doesn't entail that you've caused me to do that by placing me in that situation.
What if unbeknownst to me, someone paid you $1 million to pick the steak?
Well, then now you're changing the situation, aren't you? So now it's a different counterfactual, and that's what you're missing. If you change the counterfactual, then sure, it's not going to apply because it's a different counterfactual.
God can determine what the counterfactuals are.
Right. That's what Molinism, right. And he knows how we would freely respond in any given counterfactual. But as long as we're the first movers, then he can create the counterfactuals, and whatever I do, I'm doing freely.
Okay, fair point. So we have gone now with 50 minutes. I will ask you, do you have time to get into my arguments? If not, it's okay. We could save it for another
Yeah.
time.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do it.
Very good. Then I shall bring them up. I only have three. Hopefully they will be
Forgot
rather.
about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Which one is the first one? This would be the interaction problem. So, premise 1. Space and spaceless, material and immaterial are excluded middles. That is to say, you either have one or the other. Premise 2. For an integration between two things, there must exist a context, that is, a middle ground in which that interaction takes place. Otherwise, they cannot be causally related. Premise 3. The mind is related to the material and spatial world. Conclusion. Therefore, the mind is material and exists in space. Therefore, the soul does not exist. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I thought you were going to go through all of them. Okay, we'll do one at a time, I guess. We could have done that with mine too. Okay, so you said, so premise 2, for an interaction between two things, there must be a context that is a middle ground in which that interaction takes place. Otherwise, it cannot be causally related. So you're saying so in order for A to interact with B, there has to be a C. Is that correct?
Sure, yes.
Okay, and how does A interact with C?
Why would I be the one answering this question? I thought you were the one answering.
Because that's your premise 2. Your premise 2 is there has to be some type of intermediate context and some intermediate mechanism. How are you going to avoid an infinite regress?
I don't know, but it does seem to me you're shifting the burden of proof here.
No, you're able to make the claim. It's your premise. It's your burden to bear, not mine. I'm just asking the questions. It seems like a bad argument to me, based on premise 2.
Well, sure, but here's the thing. I'm not claiming that the interaction is indeed taking place. So if I can't answer how the interaction takes place, that's not a problem for me. I don't believe the interaction is taking place. You do believe the interaction is taking place.
Right, but your premise 2 is for an interaction between two things. So don't even talk about the soul. Talk about anything, A and B. According to you, on premise 2, there has to be an intermediate mechanism. That's going to apply to everything. How do you avoid an infinite regress? Because otherwise, you're just going to be ad hoc special pleading that this only applies for the soul and not for anything else. But if it applies to everything, how do you avoid an infinite regress for any and everything to happen?
Well, hold on. That's why we have premise 1. So, for example, let's say, how does a pen interact with a paper? Well, I would be the interaction process, but I'm also something physical. I'm not something immaterial, somehow mentally directing a pen with telekinesis. That would demand explanation. So the point is, premise 1 is the excluded middles. So, for example, my hand and a pen aren't excluded middles. They're both something physical, thus they can interact. So it's not there's the arguments to be taken as a whole. For two things that are excluded middles, and you're claiming they interact, the burden is on you to explain how that's even possible.
So I think you're dodging the question and trying to say, no, look at the bigger argument and don't look at my faulty premise 2. No, your premise 2 is part of your overall argument. If you're going to posit something intermediate, you're going to have to do that with everything. And just because it's two physical things doesn't mean all of a sudden we don't need an explanation. We still need an explanation. So if there's an intermediate mechanism, I'm going to ask again, and I'm not going to let off on this point because it's your argument. How do you avoid an infinite regress? When you raise your arm, what was the process? What caused your arm to raise?
How about I do this? How about I concede I don't have an answer?
Okay, so then the first argument doesn't work. What's your next one?
Will you now answer the question on how you believe it's possible for an immaterial mind to interact with a brain?
So a few things. So first, I would say that this is an epistemic objection, not an ontological objection, which is an important thing to note. In other words, you're asking, how does it work? My arguments, if true, would establish that a soul would exist. How it works with the body is a separate question. I can know that my car functions and that it exists. And you say, but you're not a mechanic. You don't know how it works. And I might say, you're right, I'm not a mechanic, but it doesn't follow that therefore there is no car, or that I don't know how to operate it, or that I can't drive it. So that's not an objection at best. That's a challenge epistemically to how it is. Now, I would take that it's a primitive direct action. It's a basic action. It's just A causes B, and there's no intermediate mechanism, because I think it would have to lead into an infinite regress. But if the arguments I've argued for pass, consciousness is not physical, it would need to be grounded as something, an immaterial substance, and not just floating around. And I'm not identical to my brain and body, then it follows a soul exists, even if I can answer how they interact. But I think it is what's called in philosophy a primitive action.
So are you disagreeing with premise 1? That these are excluded middles?
put your premise one back up again, or could you read it to me, or you can just read it to me? Okay, space and spaceless material and immaterial are excluded middles. That is to say, you either have to have one or the other. That's more okay. That's a statement. What are you asking? If I disagree that you have to have one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, because if you want to deny the rest of it and say, okay, there's no third kind of interaction mechanism, then you have to explain, well, then if you're just saying A causes B, then how can A cause B if they're excluded middles?
So we're going back to that. So if it's a primitive action, so if I say, how does your car work? Well, you do this. And how do you do it? And you do this. Or you say, how did you get here? Well, I got in my car. Well, how did that happen? What, the tires rolled. How did the tires roll? Well, because of the engine. At some point, you're going to have to hit bedrock and say, the first thing I did was put the key in the car, in the ignition. Well, how did you put the key in the ignition? Well, like that. I mean, there's no other. There's no
talking about a bunch of different physical things which aren't excluded middles.
The point, though, is that it's a primitive, basic action. There's nothing intermediate. I could just say I don't know, but I take it as a primitive action, and there's. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, there's.
No, I mean, I'll be happy to give you the last word and allow people to see the insufficiency of your answer there.
Because didn't you say it was a virtue to say you didn't know about something? So I'm okay with saying I don't know how.
I'm glad the Christian has finally done that for once.
But I take it as a primitive action, and if it's a primitive action, how questions become almost pointless, and then you have to ask what questions, as like, what does it mean for the interaction to happen and take place? Well, it means that when I have a volition to do something, it is manifested in my body. When you ask, what does it mean to be, how is the number 2 even? Well, because it's divisible by 2. Well, how is it divisible by 2? You're going to hit bedrock, and it no longer becomes relevant to ask how, but rather what it means to be even. And that's where you hit that basic bedrock primitive part. And I think the interaction between the soul and body is a primitive basic action. And if you don't like that, I can say, other than that, I don't know.
I'm happy to give you the point. People can make up their own minds. So here's my second argument. This is the problem,
I hope, right?
Of other minds.
I prefer, this is pointless.
I prefer it be a calculator type function. That way we know they're getting a correct conclusion, not just using their biases to decide ahead of time what they want to do.
Can a calculator know if it's wrong?
Well, it doesn't have a mind, but if it did.
Well, what if it was just epiphenomenal? What if something just consciously emerged and it just kind of had thoughts and beliefs, but they didn't do anything? If you're just a complicated calculator with a thought, that's still determined. You have no idea whether you're right or wrong.
I would say there's clearly much more going on up here than a calculator. I would hope.
I'd beg to differ, but okay.
I would anyway. Premise 1: if the soul exists, we cannot have knowledge of the existence of other minds. I assume that's where you want to push back. I do have justification. Premise 2: but we do have knowledge of the existence of other minds. Therefore, the soul does not exist.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I pushed the wrong button. So your premise. So first of all, I reject premise 1. I don't even know how.
I think you would.
I would need you to back that up. But let me look at premise 2 really quick. But we do have knowledge of the existence of other minds. How so? How do you know other minds exist?
Well, see, I think this is particularly. Well, there's 2 things I'd like to say, but the first I'll just say is, because I believe I'm fundamentally a biological machine, and that's what I believe the mind ultimately boils down to, then I can...
The mind is a machine?
We've been through this. It is caused by
both sides of your mouth.
In the physical, biological... This biological machine produces experiences, and we label that the mind. Right?
So the mind is a function of the brain?
I would like my previous arguments to stand on their own merits, because I don't know if we have a specific, because again, it depends on what you're talking about when you say the word mind.
Well, I'm asking you, it's your argument. It's your argument. So you tell me what you mean. It's your argument.
Okay, but this is I think you accused me of this earlier. It's a I know you are, but what am I thing. I mean,
no. I actually gave my definition of mind in my opening. I know it was brief and quick because I wanted to get to this, but you haven't told me what you think. Let me just re-ask the question. Is the mind a function of the brain? Yes or no? Is that your position?
The experiences and first-person experiences and the qualia that I call the mind, yes, are ultimately produced by the brain.
So yes, the mind is a function of the brain?
Sure, if you want to use that language, I'll go with it for now.
Okay, are functions true or false?
It's not merely a function. I see, but now you're talking about the beliefs that correlate to the information that's stored in the functions of the brain.
Well, so when you say, that's why I asked you the question. You're not seeming to want to answer. If it is a function, and if that is of identity, then
Well,
go ahead.
No, I mean, here's the thing: is I think we're getting off the path here. I mean, as
You
far
always
as
say that every time you get trapped in a corner. You always say, "Well, we're
okay, but here's the point. Would you and I let's forget either of our justification for this? Would you and I agree on the second premise here?
say again."
Would
Would
I
I agree with the
on-
second premise? That we do have no, I would say yes, but I think I have a justification for that. I don't know how you could possibly have a justification for that.
But this is not an argument against my position. It's an argument against yours. I can say maybe I don't have knowledge of the existence of other minds. Fine, but this isn't an argument against my position.
Well, then your argument doesn't work. There's an objection if you don't think premise 2 is true.
Well, the point is you think premise 2 is true. Right. So
I reject premise 1.
Okay, now let me really briefly get into my justification for this. So the idea here is knowledge. Would we at least agree on the definition of knowledge being justified true belief?
Sure.
Okay, good. Which means if it's going to be justified, it has the probability has to be greater than 50-50, right? It has to at least be 149.
I don't know if I'd say that, but let's go with that. Because it sounds like you're into some Bayesian stuff. I admittedly haven't even opened a book on that, but let's go with it. Why not?
Neither have I. I'm just naturally this intelligent. So knowledge is justified true belief. It has to be greater than 50-50 for you to have that knowledge of the existence of other minds. So my point is if you have
wait, hold on. Knowledge, say that again. Knowledge of what has to be greater than 50-50?
The reason to believe that there are existence of other minds has to be greater than 50-50 for it to count as knowledge.
And how would you measure that?
Otherwise, yes. Well, that's why I was asking you if you grant it. You said for the sake of argument, you'd grant it has to be greater than 50-50. So I'm just going with what you.
Well, sure, and then to right, and I'm asking how would you measure that? Like if I'm granting it, I'm saying okay, let's go with that. Given that you've thought about this and you're naturally this smart, how would you measure? How would you measure that? Well, help me out here.
Just as you granted it has to be greater than 50-50, I could grant for the sake of argument that all we need is 51-49 in favor of the existence of other minds. And I'll agree with you that we can count it as knowledge.
That doesn't help me answer how you measure that.
Well, what specifically do you mean by measuring it? Maybe I'm missing what you're asking me.
So what do I point to that says this makes it 50-50?
Oh, well, all things being equal, right? If you have an argument, let's say you have one argument, or let's say you have 10 arguments that shift it to 51 and only 9 arguments that would shift it the other way, well, then it's going to be 51-49.
Are you talking about a degree of confidence?
I prefer to go by evidence, not just what people subjectively believe about the evidence, but sure, I guess I can go down that rabbit trail.
Well, that's what I'm asking you. How can we make this 49-51 not subjective?
Well, I'd say the evidence for it. If there's evidence, like if there's clearly evidence that the it's one of those areas where I can't say exactly where to draw the line, but obviously there's a line. Obviously, when it comes to knowing the Earth is round, the evidence in favor of a round Earth has crossed beyond 99.99% at some point, right?
Okay, so let's move on. So because I want to see where you're getting at here.
Okay, so my point is, if you have a soul, right? And of course, then that's the working definition of mind. So the point is, if you cannot,
those aren't synonymous for me. Soul and mind are soul and mind are not synonymous. But go ahead.
Okay, well then, imagine this says if the soul exists, we cannot have knowledge of the existence of other souls, but we do have existence of other souls. Okay, so if you have the soul, then whatever your knowledge is that the other quote unquote person possesses has to be justified that what they possess is actually what you possess, and the reason for believing that what they possess being similar to what you possess has to be greater than 50-50 in order for it to count as knowledge. That being said, if I'm able to provide a counter explanation, if you said, well, we know that other people have souls because they exhibit similar behaviors as I do, I could say, well, how do you know a purely biological machine wouldn't exhibit the same exact behaviors as you as a soul would? As long as I can provide that counter example, then the probability always remains at 50-50, in which case it does not constitute as knowledge.
Yeah, so there's a few things I disagree with. So first of all, so I think so far these aren't even objections. They're at best challenges. But even if these challenges are somehow at this point something one has no answer to, that wouldn't prove there's no soul. I don't see how saying I can't have knowledge of other minds proves that there's no soul, or that if there is souls, we can't have knowledge of other minds. Like you said, I would attribute the fact that when I get stuck with the pen and I see someone else get stuck with the pen, I think that they have the same mental state I do because they're analogous to me. If consciousness is not physical, like we seem, I think, to agree, and I would say it is going to be possessed by an immaterial substance, then anything that is conscious is going to have a soul. So I don't see how that would we wouldn't have knowledge of other minds or behaviors.
But that's the thing, is you're immediately assuming that they have this excuse me, the same first person experience. Let me do it this way. And the reason I typically wouldn't put this in a syllogistic form, I do it because people can see the conclusion, they can know that there's actually evidence here. But let me just do it this way. Suppose you and I built a robot. We had the latest AI technology.
I guess I hear you.
We had the latest AI technology to put into this robot. And we had it able to answer questions. We even had it able to, say, scratch its leg. And so we assume it feels an itch. It has the ability to say, I'm hungry. Can I please have something to eat? And we just assume that, oh, maybe it feels hunger. But I think you would probably agree with me that we don't think that the robot actually feels hunger or actually has the first person experience of an itch just because it scratches its leg, right? So my point is, okay, now you have other humans, they're biological machines, they scratch their legs, but how do you have any reason to believe that they are actually having the same first person experience you are, and they're not just like the complicated robot, they're not just kind of scratching the leg, and you assume they have first person experience of an itch, but really that's just the result of the biological machine.
Eddie? Yeah, sorry. A few things. So I think that when you look at a machine, first I'd say there's vast differences between us and machines. Second, I'd say that this goes to prove my point that consciousness is not third-party accessible. Second thing I would say to that is that the reason I think it's analogous, and I can say someone else has these mental states, is again because I think consciousness is something that's more obvious in your own brain and body. You know your mental states before you know anything about your brain. And when you look at other human beings and the way that human beings reproduce, then I think it's fair to say that things reproduce after their kind. You know, orange trees have orange seeds that give us other orange trees. I'm conscious. I have 2 kids, and I think they're conscious too because they came from me, and I'm conscious, and they're going to be like me. So I don't see how your argument works. And at best, you're saying, well, how do we know? Taking a skeptical position, which is fine. And you're saying, well, it could be the case. Well, you know, could be's, maybes, what ifs are a dime a dozen. Unless you can give me a reason to think they don't, I think we're justified in believing that they do.
I would just say I don't know how you. Oh, I apologize. Something just grabbed my attention. I do believe I should get to it in a second. Well, my only point is that's just speculation on your point. You say, well, because person B exhibits...
It's not speculation. If I have kids who are also human beings and they act the way I do and it's analogous, that's not speculation. That's justified. You're speculating something with no basis. Give me a reason to think.
I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're just assuming that purely biological machines couldn't exhibit the same kind of behavior that you do.
Well, I'm not saying they can't exhibit the same behavior, but behavior doesn't entail mental states.
How do
That's
you
something John Searle pointed out.
here's my question. How do you differentiate the two? How do you
Right.
differentiate? And you have mental states. I'm just granting that. Maybe you don't. Maybe I'm the only one. Maybe, whatever. But I'm granting that. Okay. And now let's say there's a purely evolutionary biological machine that exhibits the exact same kind of behaviors but doesn't have the first person experiences. How do you differentiate the two?
Well, so this would have to go into some other assumptions, and the question becomes which ones are justified and which ones are not. So, given that, again, going back to the kids, and I'm conscious, and I have kids, and I believe they're conscious because they're analogous to me. I don't see anything like that analogous to someone to just a pure physical machine. I used to be in theater arts in high school. I've seen other people. I watched movies. When I watch the Avengers, there's great actors on there. But I don't think that they're actually in pain when they act to be in pain. So you don't even need to go to a machine. You can just keep it within human beings and see that even human beings can exhibit behavior without the mental states. This goes against your position because you have no justification that if anything else I would say that the problems on your side, not mine. I'm justified in this, that given if a soul exists, then I'll even go a step further, and I don't know where you want to go with this, but I hold to a Traducian view of the soul, where my body I have the body that I do because of the soul that I have. So on my view, physical bodies presuppose, especially physical conscious bodies presuppose souls. So if there's a physical, biological, conscious body, it presupposes the existence of an immaterial substance, namely a soul.
That is very curious. Perhaps I can use a thought experiment to give you the chance to elaborate more on it, because obviously you're aware of certain science fiction kind of movies or TV shows where they'll have two people change bodies and one person wakes up, like Freaky Friday. The daughter wakes up in her mother's body. This is kind of, I guess you could say, they presuppose the idea of a soul, right? And you can take the souls and put them into different bodies. Now, here's a question. Let's assume something like that was possible, right? So let's assume somebody switched you on ours, souls or minds, right? Person different bodies. Well, whatever preferences you have for food, I'm now going to have, right? Because I have your taste buds, right? That's determined more so by the taste buds. You could say, and then I think every certain beliefs, even preferences in movies, all of a sudden you'd have to go down the list. And I think all of the stuff, your brain functions. Let's say your IQ is now my IQ. We would switch that. All kinds of things.
But yeah.
All kinds of things that, well, it would, because it's ultimately reducible to the brain. But
I understand it's reducible again. You're okay.
Let's say I have a particular kind of brain damage that, let's say I have short-term memory loss, right? That's a default in the brain. You would now have short-term memory loss because you'd possess the brain that has that defect. The problem is, once you go all the way down those things, now we're no longer distinguishable, right? The person I was is not distinguishable from the new person, because now you have all of the same characteristics of the brain. So I don't know, going on this thing where the body presupposes the mind. I think if anything, the mind presupposes the body, because that's where preferences like tastes and other things come from.
So perhaps you're not familiar with the Traducian view, and that's fine. But I'm saying that a body exists because it was the soul that drove the DNA to create the body that I have. So the soul is ontologically prior to the body. But once the body's there, hypothetically speaking, even though I don't think it's metaphysically possible, but hypothetically speaking, there could be maybe a body switch, but the body is there because the soul was ontologically prior in the first place. For substances, the doctrine of a substance versus an aggregate, when I take a tire off a car, it remains, its existence and identity remains a tire, which shows us that its existence and identity as a tire is not necessarily dependent on its connection to the car. When you so for aggregates, the parts are ontologically prior to the whole. For substances, like a dog, the whole is prior to its parts. That's why when a dog's born, its eyes and ears aren't fully developed, but it's still a dog. God forbid, it loses its tail. That tail will lose its identity as a dog tail, which is evidenced by the fact that in a few days it will decay and cease to exist because the parts are dependent on the whole. So for substances, the wholes exist prior to the parts. For purely physical objects, the parts exist prior to the whole. So what I'm saying is that on my view of the soul, the Traducian view, the soul exists ontologically prior to a body. So if a body exists, it would presuppose that there is a soul.
So what role did your toddler soul play in producing taste buds that preferred one type of food over the other?
Oh, well, if we're talking about preferences, I'm not necessarily saying that the soul produced preferences. That I'm perfectly fine with saying there's causal determinations.
Okay, well then that would go against the idea you just stated about the soul being what precedes, kind of causing the physical things to develop the way they do.
Yeah, in other words, I have hands, not paws.
Well, of course. That's because of your DNA makeup, not because of your soul.
Right, well, right, but something had to drive the information of the DNA. DNA, I mean, information in and of itself doesn't do anything. I can have a blueprint, doesn't mean it's going to build a house. You need builders.
Of course, we don't just have genetic information, we have epigenetic information as well. That is the stuff, what you're talking about, the physical stuff that composes the body. So yes, you're born with a particular genetic code. You also have epigenetic information, that is the physical stuff. So it's not just the blueprint that's present at conception. It's also the epigenetic information, which is the physical stuff, like the bricks, like the nails, like the cement.
So how can I put this? And this is where it gets a lot more technical. So the information, there has to be something that's guiding the development, right? And the DNA that's in my hair is the same DNA in another part of my body, but it's a different part of my body. My tongue and my hair are different. My eyes are different. Something is driving this. There's something behind it. Again, this goes into a lot more technical stuff, but I'm just going to go back to my point because in other words, what I'm saying is I'm rejecting your assumption that there can be bodies without souls. On my view, if there's a body, it presupposes a soul. So the objection wouldn't apply to me. Does that make sense as to why I mentioned the things I mentioned before?
Sure, yes. And I would just like to say to people, by his own admission, he's not a doctor, so I don't know why we should take his authority over the vast majority of biologists who hold to evolution and say there's no soul necessary, that it's all done by...
So this also goes into what's called organicism. There's a paper Dr. Moreland wrote, I think it's in Blackwell's Companion, where he talks about this. And there may be some footnotes in there where he does refer to doctors and where there are doctors who would agree with that position as well. So sure, don't take my word for it.
Well, Dr. Norland should collect his Nobel Prize by proving all the biologists wrong. And if you really have evidence for the soul like you think you do, go collect your Nobel Peace Prize for proving that. It would send shockwaves throughout the scientific community. But
why, when it's not a scientific question?
So okay, I do want to mention this because it is a super chat, albeit on JMD's channel, John Dunphy, that scammer, who just is only in apologetics for the money, not because he even believes it to be true. But since someone gave $5, I do believe they should be thanked, and the question should be put up. How does Eric understand the soul being created as a whole of spirit and body in Genesis?
So the question, I'm trying to understand what he means. How does he understand the soul being created as a whole spirit? I'm guessing is a question, what is the spirit in contrast to the soul? Is that what you think they're asking?
It's possible. I mean, let's say God, on your view, God formed man out of the dust. So he's clearly putting physical things together. So what role is there the soul there? How is that physical stuff comes together in your soul?
So there's two views of the origin of the soul: the Traducian view and the creationist view, the two dominant. I think Adam would fall under the creationist view of the soul, but after that happened, then you have the Traducian view taking place, where everything's reproducing after its kind.
Okay, and just for people, if people have stuck around this far, I do thank them. We do have an atheist who I don't know if you've met before, but he will destroy you with his ferociousness. Unmute yourself, Squire. You're muted. No one can hear you. You're ruining this great moment.
My bad. Yeah, as I was saying, who is this guy? Eric Hernandez. Oh, he got destroyed by Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Raw. Gotcha. Yeah, so I find it very funny that he only believes in the soul because the Hebrews obviously didn't know what wind was. I mean, boom, soul doesn't exist.
Does that sound familiar, Eric?
Yes, it does. I heard Arn Raw mention that, and I can refer people to that debate.
Yes.
By the way, that John Dunphy, yeah, he is an idiot and a scammer. I mean,
yes,
Jefferson, did you have any pertinent points to make before we get ready to close things out?
well, I actually have. I actually thought of an argument better than Maxwell's arguments because those suck. No offense, Maxwell.
Go ahead.
So, Eric, if there is no free will, would the soul still exist, or would that lower our epistemic probability for the soul's existence?
Right. So I'm not arguing that if the soul exists, necessarily free will exists. I'm saying if for free will to be possible, you'd have to be something more than something physical, namely a soul. So if free will exists, a soul exists, but it doesn't necessarily entail that if a soul exists, free will exists. I'm saying that the soul is needed for their ontologically speaking for free will to even be a possibility.
So epistemically, would we have less justification for a soul if free will did not exist and determinism was true?
I don't know if I'd say we'd have less justification. I would say that I don't think we can be justified in virtually anything we believed if there was no free will and all our beliefs were determined.
Interesting. Now, I do want to challenge free will since I won't be able to get too much into the whole soul debate. So you agree? I'm going off your definition that we're the originator of one's actions. So do you agree with Thomas Aquinas's first way, everything in motion moved it or caused it, per se? Would you agree with that premise of Thomas Aquinas's first way?
So I'm not a Thomist, but I mean, I definitely I can appreciate and respect his arguments. And you're saying if I agreed with what was that?
If everything in motion basically has a cause, or something caused it to go into motion.
Sure. Yeah. If I understand it correctly.
So does anything move the soul towards something that's more desirable?
I see. There could be influences that you could say move the soul, and I would have to ask what you mean by move. But I wouldn't say if by move you mean like inspire, sure. But I wouldn't say move as like a causal deterministic, a domino moving another domino. No.
How is there no causal link between something preceding the soul and it having this influence by it?
Right. So something that's causally determined, a cause. So you think of like an efficient cause, a domino hitting another domino. The 99th domino knocking over the 100th is the cause of the 100th domino falling. So that's a direct, efficient cause. It's not as if the 99th domino influenced the fall of the 100. It directly caused it. Now, I can have influences that are brought about, through my upbringing, through what my mom ate when she was pregnant. But if there's libertarian free will, my influences merely influence my decision-making, but they don't cause it. It's still up to me as to whether or not I act or refrain from acting upon my influences.
Yeah, it seems to me that free will seems to have this sourcing problem, and there's no explanation. It seems like the best explanation would be you were determined by that so-called influence. Why shouldn't we conclude that it was the determining factor in that so-called choice?
Yeah, so I want to say it has a source problem if the person, the conscious subject, is the source. And if you're going to say the influence was the determining factor, then it's not an influence; it's a cause.
That's why I did quotations. I'm saying it is a causal factor.
Okay, I didn't say you're kind of breaking up here and there.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. So I would just have to just reiterate what I said. If libertarian free will exists, then my influence do just that. They influence my decisions, but don't cause them. I still have to choose.
But as you told Maxwell earlier, if-thens are a dime a dozen. So,
well, if as in an argument, as a modus ponens, if P then Q is what I meant by if, not if as in if it's possible.
So would your main argument for free will, not just the definition of free will, would that be, well, we have this sort of tacit knowledge, we experience it? Is that like the main justification for libertarian free will?
That's one. I think I personally would say it's self-evident. I would also say I know what it's like to be coerced. I know what it's like to someone can put probes on my brain and cause me to believe or feel certain things. But even in these studies, it shows that these people know the difference between a belief they cause or a thought they cause versus something that was caused by something outside of themselves. So I think there is the qualia to what's cause and what's not cause, I think is something that we can intuit. It's something that we can identify based on the qualia that it has.
Interesting. So, yeah, these studies, because, they stimulated the brain, but before going in, they're aware that they're going to have these going on, right? So I think that's already prior in the brain. So I don't see how you could use that for libertarian free will.
You broke up there. I understand that. What was it?
So when someone is obviously aware, the brain is aware that it is in a different environment, and that something before it is going to be stimulated, it knows most likely, it's going to be stimulated since it's experiencing that. So why not just attribute it to that, then ad hocly assuming a soul? Well, not assuming, but concluding a soul from that, when we could possibly conclude that it's just the brain being aware of it before it happens.
So I don't think brains are aware of anything. I don't think matter's aware of anything. I think you, the self, the conscious subject, the mind, which is something the soul possesses, is aware, but I don't think your brain is aware.
Well, you would have to at least admit, though, that there's some connection with the brain and sense perception, because
of course, that's something I said from the beginning.
Yeah, obviously some blind people can't hear, and that's because there's a problem with their brain. So the brain is, yes, matter, but it's a certain type of matter that can pick up on sensory data, and it does do subconscious things for us. And some even use that with the Leibniz experiments. So like there has to be some, the brain may not be conscious, but it's more aware than, let's say, a computer, and can do more since there's cells inside of it. And even the slightest cells can be somewhat aware.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I would just be reiterating what I've already said. And the Leibniz experiment, I would just have to go back and go through. I see that. Go through the problems with the experiment itself and what was actually concluded from that. But that'll be an entirely different discussion. But I would just reiterate what I said, that I don't think the brain is aware of anything. Yates, did you have something there, Maxwell?
Nope. I am Mr. Jefferson. Are you quite done?
Well, I can go all night, but
I do want to be respectful of Eric's time. We have kept him for 2 hours.
Obviously, he has scamming to do elsewhere, so
Eric, did you have any closing thoughts you would like to leave the audience with?
So, well, I guess just to wrap up, I gave, to reiterate my case, it was 2 basic points. One is consciousness is not physical, and this was all based on Leibniz's Law of Identity, showing that there are things true of one and not the other. The 3 arguments I gave to show that I am more than a brain and body, indivisibility of personhood, identity through change, and free will. And it seems like all Maxwell Yates did was give me some hypotheticals, arguments that were fallacious, premises that even he didn't agree with, or that would be contradictory, or that would even be a problem for his position. And then he, at best, the only thing I got at best was calling his position emergent, but slapping a label on a position doesn't solve the problem. It just gives a label to the problem. But Jaegwon Kim would state something like, correlations are not explanations, but are in fact the very thing that need explaining. So just slapping a label on something doesn't solve the problem, or the hard problem of consciousness. It's still a problem, just now you just given it a different label. So I think based on what we've talked about so far, we have reason to believe in a soul, and I haven't heard any good objections against it. Maybe some complaints, but no objections.
Sure. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time. Eric Hernandez, that is also the name of the YouTube channel. It is in the description if people would like to go see the videos he's published of himself getting destroyed by Matt Dillahunty.
Were there any questions sent in aside from that one? And if not, that's fine. I was just...
So I have noticed some people arguing with each other in the chat. If there is... let me see if there's anything. I'm going to look for things with a question mark at the end. There's a couple things here. I don't know if they're questions per se. This is something Brandon Rickaball. As he says, now the body is conscious. I'm not sure. He must be talking about something we were getting at earlier. But if you can't draw anything, what you might be getting at.
Yeah, I don't remember what part of the discussion that was, but Brandon would be someone, if he's willing to, be a great person to bring on the show. He's contributed to Blackwell's Companion to Substance Dualism, recently got his doctorate, so congratulations to Brandon. So consider reaching out to him. I'd love to see him do some stuff online and get involved in the community like that. Of course, if he's willing to. I know in the past, well, he can just say it for himself, but it'd be an interesting person to bring on and discuss these kind of topics.
Very, very nice. Yes. I'm not seeing much in the chat, by the way. Well, Mr. Cafe, if that is your real name, you're putting a lot in the chat, you could throw in a question if you would like to. Jefferson, while I'm scanning for questions, you may take the floor.
Yeah, so your one argument, the indivisibility of personhood, right? That was the one argument you used. I didn't see the whole thing, but I know you've used that before. I find your view of the soul interesting, how it creates the body. So before there is a body, is the soul conscious? And like when it indwells in the body, does it lose some function, since the body can obviously affect some states of consciousness, which seems to be hurting the soul, which is why I think people use the interaction problem, because it's just like if there is this substrate that is steady flow of consciousness and can't really be affected by, well, obviously can be affected by brain parts, but it's just like, how can something like that be affected by material parts if it's the substrate?
Yeah, if I think you're still breaking up. I don't know if it's mine or your end. Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. A lot to be said there, but no, I wouldn't say it's conscious, but I would say that within everything has a nature, and within that nature, it sets law-like limits to what the thing can or cannot do. And it is a type of first mover. How that interacts, I would say that's beyond the levels that I've gone into deeply studying on the traducian view. But I do think there's lots of merit to the position itself that we haven't got into and that we probably wouldn't have time to go into. But nevertheless, the main point there was that the soul is ontologically prior to the body, and I can refer you to Moreland's section on Blackwell's Companion to Substance Dualism. Because he sent me that before it was published a while back, and it's, from what I remember, if it's still the same, he talks about what's called organicism, and he goes a little bit more into that view. And I would recommend definitely that as a source.
All right, so Cafe, I'm going to pronounce your name that way unless you correct me. And he's had a couple of questions that have come along the lines of this. So he's asked, can Eric please define specifically soul, how that would be different from his definition of consciousness? And particularly, he asks, soul and mind are synonymous if you consider the etymology as in the Greek psyche. But when Eric says soul and mind are not synonymous, Suke?
Yeah.
I get the impression he means that they're not synonyms.
Yeah, so no, I wouldn't say there's synonyms. And in the Greek and Hebrew, there's that's a whole nother discussion. But like, for example,
yes,
if the Bible says, if the Bible says that like his heart was dismayed or his face fell, we don't think literally his face fell. Even if you look in the Greek, it means the word face means face, but it doesn't mean his face fell. Now I would say that the soul is a faculty. The mind is a faculty of the soul. It's a faculty of the soul that has certain capacities. And it's the way in which I have my thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and will or volition.
Very good. Jefferson,
Do you want me to ask more stuff?
Until I find another question.
Oh, okay. So is your argument of the indivisibility of the soul, how do you identify someone in a courtroom? Is that the analogy used? Like, what's sort of the point of the analogy there? Like, obviously, in 10 years, are they the same person? Is that the argument?
So the argument is that what I used about court was more about identity through change. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that if there's going to be a continuity of identity, there has to be something that grounds this identity through change. So if I'm the same person that I was yesterday, or if I get in a car accident and lose, God forbid, some parts of me has to be amputated. If I'm the same person, then it follows that whatever grounds my existence and identity as a person and identity through change, then it can't be based on the things that I've lost if I'm still the same thing. If I'm not the same thing, then you would have to say that metaphysically speaking, that Eric ceased to exist and a lookalike came into existence, and which I think is an absurd position. But if there's no soul, I think that's a position you're going to have to take depending on how you ground identity, and then you have identity through change. So if there's a soul, then it doesn't matter what parts of my body replace. It doesn't matter if I get a pacemaker, if I get prosthetic, I'm still me, and I maintain identity through change because my existence and identity is not grounded on my physical makeup.
So why can't that marker of identity be DNA, since everyone has their own unique DNA and that doesn't change?
Yeah, well, I mean, there might be something to said that whether or not DNA can change. If I'm not mistaken, I've seen studies, and recently I've seen some other things come out that may or may not disagree with it. But basically, where twins, for the most part, seem to have identical DNA. And then if I clone somebody, they're going to have the same DNA. But obviously, they're two different people. They're not the same person. So I think there's problems with grounded it in something physical or DNA like that. But I'd go back to whatever you ground it in, it's going to have to maintain identity through change, and it can't be something physical. And I would even say it can't be something mental, because you can get hit over the head and lose your memory. But that doesn't mean that that person ceased to exist and another person came into existence.
And right along the same lines as Jefferson is arguing, someone says the soul isn't a specter, it's not a ghost. LOL, the soul is you, yourself, in the truest sense. That's it.
Yeah, I would agree.
And he says, it's Brandon Rickabaugh says, it still isn't clear to me what he thinks the soul is and what he thinks consciousness is. Can Eric give a clear definition of each?
He may have missed my opening, and Brennan knows Dr. Moreland, and I'm pretty much almost verbatim saying what Moreland usually says when he gives these talks, and that namely that the soul is an immaterial substance and is a possessor of consciousness, and then consciousness is identified ostensibly. There's 5 states. There's thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will.
Very nice. And he also says, Eric, why not answer the DNA question with the, I cannot pronounce that,
Traducian view. Yeah, and I think I did. I'd love to hear Brandon's thoughts if he wants to share them about that.
I think you did 2 years ago on a podcast that Scammer JMD did.
Oh, really?
On what?
It's not a soup, Eric. Get your facts straight.
I'd never said it was a soup. I don't know what's going on.
Well, thank God for that. What should I say? Thank my bearded sky daddy, who doesn't really exist. But I postulate because I have a fear of death.
No, you can just thank the flying spaghetti monster, who has hairy noodles for you and sacrificed one to save you from himself. Or that whole Matt Dillahunty argument that works every time. Clearly understands Trinitarian theology and has looked through all the church historical documents and views on the Trinity. I mean, just clear studying.
Jamie Russell asks, could God have designed the physical brain able to be the locus of the soul?
So I wouldn't excuse me, I wouldn't call it the locus, but he is onto something in the sense that there was a correlation between the soul and the body. And again, we can say if I cut my nails, I still exist. But at what point is it that where I lose something physical, my soul leaves my body? That's a really good question. I don't think we should do experiments to try and find out, but that's a question that is going to be settled a posteriori, that I don't think can be settled, at least I don't think can be settled a priori. But yeah, I think there would be some type of limit to where if you remove certain things, and there's going to be a disconnect of the soul and body. What that is, I don't know.
something that comes to mind is like obviously if one of you guys were to hit me in the back of the head really hard, I'd be knocked out and very unconscious. So like I'm very curious. Unless our starting point is the brain and consciousness emerges from it, and if you hit it a certain way, it goes away for a bit. That would explain it more than a soul, which is a steady state of consciousness, which is you, and seems to just disappear, going out of existence for some reason. So what do you think happens with that, Eric?
What do I think happens when you get hit over the head?
No, what do you think? What do you think happens to the soul when you get hit in the head and you're knocked out and you're not conscious
Right.
at all and don't remember anything?
Something similar to that happens when you damage a Wi-Fi router. The Wi-Fi is not damaged, but the router is.
But wouldn't that be a better analogy for property dualism?
I didn't understand it. You're still breaking up.
Oh, don't you think that would help property dualism that says that consciousness arises from the brain? So obviously, if I break my Wi-Fi router, that Wi-Fi that is dependent upon that prior to it, that disappears. While with the brain, if you hit me prior to my consciousness, I lose awareness.
Yeah, so all illustrations obviously are going to break down at some point, but even if we're going to stick with that illustration, the Wi-Fi still exists even if the router is broken. A substance dualist would still adhere to property dualism, just not merely property dualism. I do believe that there are a duality of properties. I just go a step further and also say that there is a duality of, there is two types of substances, if you will, and that's I'll just leave it at that because there's more to be said there. So a substance dualist doesn't deny property dualism. A substance dualist is going to adhere to property dualism, but go a step further and adhere to substance dualism as well.
Yeah, I guess I don't have an argument formulated, but I go with something like Occam's razor and using multiple analogies that you usually give. Like obviously smoke doesn't exist prior to fire. That's something that comes into existence. And just like with the brain, consciousness emerges from that. So I think there's more analogical points to be made there. And it assumes a lot less, I think.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think it goes into being ad hoc, and you're going to have to explain consciousness being some type of a structural property of the brain, which good luck. It's that's another whole problem in and of itself. But then it seems ad hoc when, again, without just reiterating arguments I've already laid out. I think the arguments that I laid out, and when you go to the Traducian view and things like organicism, I think that's the best position to take.
What do you mean by ad hoc?
You're saying it to avoid the existence of the soul.
Yeah, well, for my worldview, yes, I have to formulate certain arguments for it to be coherent. I wouldn't call that ad hoc. Are you saying there's an intention behind saying something is ad hoc?
I'm not sure I follow.
Well, is there, in your definition of ad hoc, it seems to imply I have the intention to avoid and just reformulate things with the intention of just assuming my worldview. I'm not actually open-minded.
Oh, well, let me ask this first. I don't know if you're still playing the Jefferson atheist role, or if you're. What was that?
What are you talking about? I am Jefferson the Octory. But yeah. see, an argument, because for some reason this body goes to John Dunphy again. So there seems to be something going on there in this dude's head. Not just one soul, perhaps maybe two.
Yeah, maybe.
Plantinker's Bulldog says Eric should really become an idealist, and I realize that's more of a statement, not a question, but perhaps it would be an interesting question to say, what are your thoughts on idealism?
Yeah, so I don't personally have a problem with it. I think to some extent, all Christians are going to have to, in some sense, in a loose sense, perhaps, and I don't know the technical terminology because I haven't looked too much into idealism, but in some sense, everything is going to be dependent fundamentally on mind, namely God's mind. So everything exists. Was before everything was an unembodied mind, namely God. So without God and him sustaining everything in existence, then nothing would exist. So in that sense, I'd be okay with talking about idealism, but I wouldn't go as far as some idealists may in saying that there is no matter and everything is just mental states. But again, I've never really, it hasn't interested me, I guess you can say. But to some extent, yeah, things are based and fundamentally come from God being a mind who created everything and sustains everything in existence, and without him, nothing would exist.
So translation, for those who didn't get it, Eric thinks all idealists are idiots.
Sounds ad hoc to me.
Yes.
No, a good friend of mine, Michael Jones, is an idealist, and I respect that guy very much.
Oh my
Smart guy.
goodness. Yeah,
Jefferson and I destroyed him in a debate already.
we tore him apart. He literally takes man's word over his God's own word. I mean, it's hysterical what apologists have to do. And the word salads and mental gymnastics they jump through. Word salads, even though that's only a term in psychology with narcissistic abuse, it's still word salads, but that's all it is.
So I see. It looks like we have gone through all the questions, at least the ones I could find, in the comments. So, Eric, I do thank you for taking the time to be here. Oh, good thing somebody got their question in before I closed out. What is the logical argument for something from nothing? It seems to me that the soul and conscious mind are related. Am I wrong? Why? Perhaps one of you two understand the question. I'm not sure I get everything.
Well, there's nothing constraining nothing, so obviously it can create something. So I mean, obviously.
Yeah, well, I mean, Stephen Hawking said because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing.
Yeah, I mean, nothing is constraining nothing. So what's stopping it from creating something?
So I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is asking. Maybe they can rephrase it, but it may be a misunderstanding. If I understand it, it may be a misunderstanding of the understanding of what they're trying to ask. But yes, the soul and mind are related in that the mind is a capacity, a faculty of the soul. So it's kind of like Moreland would say, think of the soul as a chest of drawers. You have a sock drawer, underwear drawer, t-shirt drawer, pant drawer. There's different faculties, compartments. So my soul has different faculties. One of them is consciousness, and one of them is my faculty of spirit. And just like it's my tongue that tastes, not my fingers, my eyes see, not my ears. Within my soul, it is my spirit that communicates with God, and it is my mind is the faculty through which I have my mental conscious states of thoughts, beliefs, sensations, etc. And in a similar vein, those faculties are responsible for specific functions, but they're all a part of my soul, contained within my soul, within the nature and essence of who I am. So yes, they're related. It's just that the soul is what grounds my mind.
I have one more question for Eric. Oh, never mind.
Well, Brandon Rickabald takes priority. I hate to break it to you, Jefferson. A number of philosophers of mind who embrace naturalism are abandoning physicalism for views like panpsychism and Russellian monism. What do you think is contributing to this change?
Yeah, I'd love to hear his answer because I'm sure he'd have a much better answer than mine. But I think if you look at, and if I understand it correctly, you look at people like Nagel. I think they're starting to see that there is something fundamentally different between a matter and something that they would call sui generis, like mental states. That is genuinely something different. That is unlike anything else. And consciousness, and I know Brennan's written stuff on consciousness, and he could speak a lot more to that as well. But I think that we're starting to realize that you have to be able to do something with this. And emergentism, I would say, it is no good, especially on a naturalist perspective, because you don't want to get something from nothing. So you're going to have consciousness there from the beginning somehow. And panpsychism seems to be the best option to go with if you're trying to avoid God. And I think there's a shift, because the more we're learning about what consciousness is, the more we're seeing it's fundamentally different than anything like physical matter that we know. You can describe a matter without ever appealing to consciousness. So once we start describing consciousness, we know we're describing something fundamentally different.
Very interesting. Jefferson, what was your question?
Yeah, so multi-personality disorder, how would you reconcile that with your indivisibility of personhood argument?
Yeah, so to be clear again, the property of being a person. So think of being even. Number 2 is even. Number 6 is even, but the number 6 is not more even than the number 2. Non-degreed properties are properties that don't fluctuate or change. They're all or nothing kind of things. Personhood is an all or nothing kind of thing. So if a person is conscious, they are persons, and they're not and if they go into a coma, they're not now 80% persons. They're still persons that have just lost functioning. Now, that's a separate question regarding something like multiple personality disorder. That's not necessarily dividing personhood. If anything, it's if I'm not mistaken, it's a soul fragmentation. I've heard the term used, where certain things are happening. Let me just use the illustration again. To the Wi-Fi router, the antenna or the channel is being affected by the antenna, and you're getting some static on some channel, and the channel keeps flipping. So there's some things happening physically that are having an effect on the mind. And it's a two-way street. We know through neuroplasticity and cognitive behavioral therapy, you can also change the chemistry of your brain by changing the way you think. And if you change the brain, it could also, in principle, change the way you think. So it's a two-way street. And I think that would also go to lend credibility to substance dualism, that you are more than just a brain and body.
I just find it interesting that new personalities or new thoughts or minds are almost created in personality disorders, that something physical can affect something that is supposed to be substrate and a steady flow of consciousness so much. Did I break up again?
Yeah, I was trying to understand the question. I understand it.
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was sort of my retort, but it's getting kind of late.
Yes, you did not break up. You were broken up with, probably because you're so ugly. But
well, Stelman, now that you mentioned that, are you you're just trying to catch up with JMD on subscribers by unloosening some buttons there to try and seduce your audience? Which, I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do to get subscribers, but
I'm not sure who it was you were talking to there, but with
did I say Stelman? I meant Maxwell Yates.
Yes, exactly. And I am already ahead of you in subscribers. Click on my channel, why don't you? Also, click on Eric Hernandez's channel in the description of this video. Dr. Eric Hernandez, thank you.
Not a doctor.
Thank you for reminding me that we shouldn't take your word because we're not an expert. So
I'm still waiting for him to collect his Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly, for proving so. Should have sent shockwaves to the scientific community. But Eric, thank you for being here and for putting up with us. And until the next episode, we will see you next time. Jefferson, sign us out with your phrase.
Yeah, Eric can pray for us for our souls to be saved, but we're thankful for his brain and mind. And remember, you gotta keep both eyes open.